Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing great today. I feel a lot better at the moment. It turns out I had a chest infection, but I got antibiotics really quick, so I've got better straight away. Thank you for all the kind comments, and as always, there's a message before the video starts. I have timestamps in the description, so if you want to go straight to the stories, then just click on one of them. So for today, I just wanted to share this. As hard as it may be to seem now, you can actually turn around everything that's happening in your life at the minute. You've got to understand that your brain might be in a place where you can't actually see it and accept it, but if you make up in your mind that no matter what, you're not going to give up, your brain starts to find ways to get around things and to overcome. It's almost like no matter what's in front of you, your brain's forced into overcoming it, and keeping that belief is something you can build upon. You might not feel it every single day, but that's the way that mental health will work. You just have to know to stay into the fight, and oftentimes that's the most important thing. It's quite simple, but it can actually do a lot of good. And remember too that you can imagine that you're starting over your life right now. A lot of people wait for New Year, which is something I don't really understand because it's just a day like any other by a calendar that humans have set that could have been done at any time. You have the power to make the changes right now. You don't have to wait any longer. And I believe I've said this before, but it's from somebody else who said that imagine right now you're watching a movie where someone's life might be a complete mess, and right now they might have everything going wrong against them, and they don't believe, and they're waking up late every day down, not really doing anything. Now imagine they're going to turn it around right this second, and all the things that they would be doing. And imagine a hero emerges from this story, and the hero is you. What would you be doing right now if you were living that movie? Because it might be a similar circumstance, but you can turn it round and you have the power to. You don't have to let anybody else know exactly what you're doing, and some things are better to keep to yourself, but just know that you're doing it for yourself and it is possible. It's little things like this that can make a big difference, and I really think can help people. So I just wanted to share that. I hope you're all doing great. I love you, and you're not alone in your struggles. Enjoy these stories, and make sure you check out my Instagram at Joe the Insomniac and the podcast in the description below. If you're interested in what I look like in real life, then make sure you check out my Instagram at Joe the Insomniac. This occurred when I was 18 and backpacking my way through the world. I always looked a few years younger than my actual age and often had problems getting into places. I often find myself hissing, "No, I'm really an adult," to the people who refuse to believe my ID card. I arrived in Western Australia in January in a little town that looked nothing like the brightly coloured postcard world that I left behind in Sydney. I rented a car and was getting used to the Aussie way of driving and didn't pay attention to the fact that I'm running out of fuel. So naturally, now the car suddenly gives up. I wasn't worried though. I had a spare tank in the trunk. I had problems getting the lid off though. No matter how hard I pulled it, it didn't give in. So I started walking back to the little cluster of shops I spotted earlier. I was greeted by a man on an ATV-ish thing, sitting outside a shop. He nodded in the direction of the road and said, "Problem with the car, missy?" I must have looked puzzled because he smiled and said, "No one comes walking in here from that direction. There's nothing out there." I explained the situation and he listened sympathetically. "Do you rent the car from the Free Freddy? No wonder he gave you it. You can't trust that bloke, you see." He introduced himself as Charlie and quickly got off and offered me a spare tank, saying, "You want to ride back? It's an awfully warm day. No ozone layer here, you see." He was speaking weirdly. I felt a bit stupid hesitating, but he seems like a nice guy. And he was right. The sun was terrible. My shoulders already burnt despite sun cream. He must have sensed my hesitation because He put a hand on my shoulder and said, "I'm not the boogeyman, I promise you. I just don't want anyone out here in this weather. I would have offered you a ride if you're a 40-year-old bloke too. Here, take my helmet. My head ain't worth protecting anyway." And so I get on the back of his ATV, the spare petrol tank in front of me, and get a somewhat uneasy feeling in my stomach. "Just tap my shoulder if you want me to slow down, alright?" He drove the short distance to my car, but he didn't slow down. I tapped his shoulder again and again. He drove past it. In the rearview mirror, I could see him grin as he speeded up. I can't jump. The speed was so high it would have killed me, and I had no idea where he was taking me, but I knew his intentions were evil. This continued for 30 minutes, until I could see a rest stop, clearly made for people to stop and enjoy the view. As we approached the rest stop, I see my chance and grab hold of his throat with both hands, squeezing as hard as I can. I felt him struggle to keep the vehicle on the road, while fighting for air. As we come up alongside the rest stop, he had no choice but to stop. I threw myself off, tossing the helmet and screaming loudly enough to wake the dead. There was a truck there, but no one in view. However, only a moment later, the door to the loo opened, and this terrifying looking man with a beard pops out and demanded to know what the hell was happening. I pointed to my abductor and cried that he tried to kidnap me, and the grisly man tried to grab a hold of the abductor but wasn't fast enough. Soon, he was gone. The grisly man turned out to be really nice and phones the police for me, waiting with me until the police arrive. Since that day, I don't judge by appearance. Charlie was a nice looking person and seemed to have good intentions. George looked like he had been awakened from his ancient lair, but was a really good guy. I later made my way back home, and this is by far the creepiest thing that ever happened to me. Back in 2000 or 2001, I was driving by myself, from visiting my mum in Colorado back to Arizona. I was in a station wagon and had a desk my mum had given me that was my grandfather's. I've always been scared driving at night, and I'm always worried there's someone in my back seat that's gonna get me. This might be because I've watched far too many scary movies, or because my mum's paranoia rubbed off to me. I was in the army and drove back and forth a lot to visit her. She would get mad at me for sleeping at rest stops or gas stations, telling me someone's gonna kidnap or kill me. But I just didn't want to be bothered with the hassle and expense of a motel most of the time. So I'm driving on an empty section of highway late at night with no other cars around. This red truck comes up behind me, flashing me with his lights and honking his horn at me. I was thinking to myself that there was something wrong with my car. Maybe there was something wrong with the desk in the hatchback. Because why else would somebody be so insistent on me pulling over? So I pull over and get out of my car. As I'm getting out of my car, he's directly behind me, still flashing his lights and honking his horn. I go to about the middle of the car. I planned on going to the back to see what could have been wrong with my car when it hit me. Why is he still honking at me when I'm getting out? That's odd. Then he gets out of his truck. That's when I knew something just wasn't right. I jumped back in my car and sped off. The nearest exit's 50 miles away or so. He follows me the entire time. I take the first exit and go to a crowded grocery store with a laundromat next to it. There was an ambulance parked at the laundromat with its lights flashing, and I'm next to it, I figured there was an ambulance, so there must be police officers there. Now the man stayed in his truck in the grocery store parking lot watching me the entire time. I was terrified. I didn't want to get out of my car and felt like an idiot if I would have had to tell someone what happened. I waited an hour and finally he left. After he left, I waited a little longer before continuing my drive back to Arizona. I was paranoid and watched for any red trucks the entire time. Fast forward about 5 or 6 years, I was watching a crime show on TV, and what story pops up? One about a man on that exact stretch of highway with the same red truck, using them tactics to get a woman to stop before murdering her and others. I'm so glad that my gut told me something was wrong, and I got back in my car and kept on driving. This happened to my wife while we were dating. When we were dating, I lived in southern New Hampshire and she lived in Philadelphia. Most of the time, I would come down and visit her. Since she works at college, she had a few weeks off in December. She decided to come up and stay with me. She's packed a week's worth of clothes and her cat in the car and drove up after work. Driving on an interstate at night means coffee, which means bathroom breaks. She pulls into a rest stop in Connecticut. By rest stop, I mean bathroom, vending machine, and a rack of tourist brochures. As she's walking towards a building, a man, wearing jeans, an army jacket and knife cap walks out between 2 cars starting on her. The man immediately reaches out, grabs her head with both hands. He's standing in front of her, arms out straight. She's not able to pull his hands off her head. He's staring into her eyes with a detached expression. As she described it, I think it's the same expression I use when I'm trying to debug or figure out why something isn't working. He's moving her head back and forth, keeping her off balance, keeping her at arm's length. She stares back. He seems to evaluate her for a minute or two, then lets go and quickly walks into a wooded section. She runs into the rest stop, finds an attendant. She uses a bathroom, then tells the attendant is willing to walk her out to her car to make sure she leaves safely. She walks out with the attendant and notices that a white van that was previously there is gone. She gets in the car, thanks the attendant, and drives off. About 10 minutes later, she's processed what happened and calls me. Then, the bit about the van worried her, but terrifies me. We talk for a little bit. She's familiar with the law enforcement and offenders and have a brief that this wasn't just a foul mugging. She talks to the police, but they didn't seem to be too interested. What worried her the most was that her cat would have suffered in the cold if something happened to her. After that, every time I drove between NH and PA, I've stopped at the rest stop for a few minutes to try and look for white vans. I don't know what I could have done, maybe got a reg plate at least, but I've never seen them. It's terrifying thinking there's people out there like this. I'm just glad nothing ever happened then. First, I'm gonna say I'm a 16-year-old male with paranoia. I always carry a knife with me and get scared easily. I'm 175 pounds, 5'7" and a power lifter. I was crossing Alabama into Mississippi when I had to use a bathroom. My grandfather was driving me back to my dad's house in Jackson, MS. He pulled into a rest stop area and stretched his legs when I got to the bathroom. There was no security at the rest area, and bathroom is in the back of the building. The only person in there with me was at a urinal. I walked to the stall farthest from the door. As I walked by him, he turned around and started walking at me. His pants weren't unzipped at the urinal. He reaches for something in his pocket and I hear a flick. That's when I realised that something's in his hand, and I forgot my knife. I then see the bathroom door open and someone came in. The guy's coming towards me, putting his pocket in his hands, and left. This happened 2 weeks ago. The guy was white, bald in late 30s, maybe 40s. He had a black shirt with green cargo shorts, and I haven't really told many people about this. I'm very grateful that the stranger came in when he did. God knows what would have happened to me if he didn't. This was a story I grew up hearing my mum telling me about. I was really young when this happened, and I know for a fact it was before I was 5. I only have some foggy memory of the event, especially because my mum at the time didn't want to freak me out. Now, for some context, first, we have a family all over the country. I remember spending so much of my childhood just on the road trips from state to state to visit family. So we know our ins and outs on travelling. 2. When I was a child, I would randomly hug strangers telling them I loved them. I was so filled with joy and love that it just spilled over to everyone. There was basically only one stranger I never immediately latched onto the second I saw them, being this story. So my mum was talking to me, and we're taking a visit to see some relatives while my dad was staying at home with brothers. So she had to go to house sit, and in general is a better caretaker of me than my father, so it made sense I went with her. We were driving for hours until we finally hit a rest stop, and so got out to use the bathroom. Now, there was already this guy in the parking lot, and according to my mum, it looked like he was watching everyone who entered and left the rest stop. The second we get out of the car, he did too. My mum held my hands as we went into the restroom, but immediately picks up on the fact that I let go of her hand to hold the other, the way facing the man. Now looking back, she told me that it was clear somewhere in my tiny child brain that I picked up on some sign of danger, because I avoided this man as much as I possibly could and would quicken my pace to the restroom and car. I never did that with another stranger again. I had never blatantly avoided another adult like that. Anyway, as we do our business and head back to the car, the man had gone and left us, only then to follow us back in his own car. My mum immediately realised what was going on, trying to shake him off on the highway. He wouldn't budge, and tried to get as close as he could. Apparently while doing this, a semi-truck driver notices how frantic and off she was driving and could see her looking in the back. He realised what's going on and drove up to her side, making eye contact with her, and they're on the same page from then on out. Turns out, the driver called up on the radio to other truckers saying what was going on, and a bunch of drivers from different routes nearby came to the same highway that we're travelling on. A few minutes later, they began blocking out the other guy's car, and essentially trapped him away from my mum and I as she turned onto the next exit to find another rest stop, as the original truck driver follows us in. He got out and talked to my mum and told her he picked up what was happening, asking if we're okay, and drove with us to a Burger King and got something to eat. We talked and he got back onto the road until eventually we go separate ways. So to the guy who was probably going to kidnap me and my mum, thank God you never got a chance to, and thank God for the truck drivers who probably saved our lives. My dad works for a large printing company, and they completed an overnight rush job for a business. My dad got tasked with dropping the order off. It would take 8 hours each way to drop off the order. He was going to take my mum, as she's a retired teacher, and he figured it would be nice to have someone to drive each way. However, the night before he was going to leave my mum, he comes down with the flu. He left early the next morning and promises my mum if he gets tired, he's going to stop either at a restaurant or rest stop. So he made it without incident to drop off the papers. It's about noon when he set off again, and soon realises that the traffic's horrible. My dad decided that he'd take the long way home. It would add an hour or so, but he feared it would take longer to wait in the traffic. He drove straight for hours, until he realised he had to pee, and badly. My dad's a prostate cancer survivor, so needs to pee a lot. Also, he was starting to get sleepy and figured he should pull over and take a nap. It was winter, so about 4:30. Now it's winter and about 4:30, and the sun started to set, and he notices a stop ahead, quite glad to be able to rest. He pulls up. Now, he does a little stretch, calls my mum to tell her that he's stopping to stretch his legs and maybe catch a nap, then heads to the bathrooms. Now the place was pretty much deserted. There's an old Chevy pickup next to my dad, and there was an RV with a family packing up that was probably their dinner. He went into the bathroom and opened the first stall. He was in there doing his business when he hears someone talking. He thinks at first they're talking to him until he realizes that the person A is on the phone, or B, they're talking to themselves. It's okay. It's gonna be okay. We'll just take another one and then bring it to the mother, the man said, almost singing to himself. My dad said he sounded like he was young, between late teens to early 20s. Then, before my dad could say anything, he starts unzipping his pants, starting to get weird. The guy randomly starts screaming, smashing his head onto the mirror and then on the wall. He started screaming in a more high-pitched voice now. At that, my dad runs out of the stall and he quickly opens a bathroom door running to his car. He locks the car door when he notices a skinny young man running out of the bathroom. He's looking for my dad and sees his car. My dad starts the car and begins backing up when he literally runs full tilt at him, screaming. My dad drove off. He's so badly shaken up by this that he had to pull over to the next town just to relax. He was paying for his coffee when that same Chevy pulls up. My dad grabs his coffee and hides his face. The kid walks in, goes up to the nice older cashier who my dad brought coffee from, throws his arms around this woman and starts sobbing about how he's sorry, mother, and how he let another one get away. My dad's heard more than enough now and quickly tosses his coffee away and quickly sprints to his car and makes it home safely. To this day, my dad refuses to stop at any rest stops now. He only stops at major places you can actually pull over at. So my first story is actually my friend's story. So during these times, things took place when we were all in high school. I already knew about skinwalkers and the like, but when these things happened to me, I wasn't sure if it really was a skinwalker at the time or something else. I've noticed that Most of the people who tell me they've experienced the same phenomenon live in the same area that I do, and my friend is no exception. Let's call him Jay. Jay lives maybe 5 minutes away from me. She told me that in her bus, there's this one area that they drive by to drop this kid off. She said she doesn't know why, but it always gives her the creeps. She told me that one early morning, when they were driving in that area to pick him up, all the kids in the bus saw this deer running alongside the bus. Not away from it, but besides it. She said it looked weird as hell. You know, the usual stuff about appearing humanoid. And it didn't look right. Like its limbs were awkwardly bent in a way that didn't seem human. And its eyes were freaky. This is my friend who doesn't know anything about skinwalkers or anything of that mumbo jumbo. So I basically get chills. I tried being reasonable though, because maybe she just saw a regular deer, and since it was dark out, she just got confused, because it's Florida. We're not supposed to get that kind of thing down here. However, Jay swore up and down that it was not a normal deer. She said they all saw it and the bus driver slowed down to get a better look because everyone was weirded out by it, and it was basically something they've never seen before. After a while it ran off to disappear. Jay could have made this up, but like I said, why would she, and she's never seen anything like it. So anyway, I get freaked out because here I am knowing about this frickin' skinwalker, and my friend is literally clueless, thinking it's just a regular weird animal and she's just had a weird experience. Oh god. I ask her, do you even know what skinwalkers are? She just looked at me and said, what's that? I googled it and showed her the deceptions of skinwalkers, and she said, that's what I saw, but it had the head of a deer. She kept on saying it didn't look human or like an animal. After a while too, the kid from that bus stop didn't come back. Although that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with this, I just thought it was weird. So we were freaking out together, because what she said reminded me about what I heard at night, about it not being animal or human. See, a couple of years back before she told me the story, I found myself one night sitting in my backyard like really early, maybe 3 in the morning or so, because I was thinking about things due to personal reasons. Now I'm kind of just chilling and enjoying the silence when all of a sudden I hear this really freaky echoing scream from far away. The only way I can describe it as though that a woman and a cat were trapped together inside of a bag screaming like they're getting murdered. I know mountain lions, foxes and owls are a thing, and they make the weirdest calls, but I looked up that stuff and it's just not the same. Like usually, you wouldn't be able to tell if it's an animal, right? It's just common sense, like my friend said. But that don't sound like animal or human. It sounded really unnatural and weird. Now me being me, I was really upset at first. Now the thing was really far away, and I actually thought that they might even be killing someone in the streets at 3 AM. That thing travelled so fast though. It sounded freaky as hell, and it was getting closer as it got to the more weird and unnatural sound. It only took me a couple of seconds to realise that this isn't a woman and this ain't a cat. Because while this was going down, I was going through it in my head like, what the hell is that thing? The first thing went from sounding like a good couple of miles away to being in my goddamn neighbourhood in 5 seconds. It was so weird because One second it sounded far away, and the next, it's on my street. I had a heart attack. The second I stood up, the scream just stopped, just like it started. And I'm really thinking at this point that it must be in front of my house. I walk as calmly as possible back inside, locking the doors, and the scream was back again, far away. I also heard some scraping and tapping sounds on my windows, but it happens at the same time now. I'd say 2 to 4 o'clock in the morning, and seen some black figures that aren't really affected by light outside of my house. To add detail to those things so you can get a feel for it, basically what happened is that I was doing a project for class, and since I procrastinate like I'm a pro up until 2 AM, I go to wash my hands from all the graphite, and the water's running while I hear a scraping sound against one of the bedroom doors that leads to my backyard. Now most of the door is made up of these glass panes, the kind that make everything appear distorted and like blobby ash lumps. But then I see something pointy, dark against the window, almost looking ghost-like. I turn off the water and wait a bit, and it comes back and scrapes against the window again. I'm not trying to freak out, but my hands are shaking. It's stupid, but I actually whisper, "What are you doing?" while my voice trembled, and it stopped. I stop, and I don't hear anything except for what sounded like somebody walking by the window to the house every now and then. It continued that way for some nights too. Off and on, I would be hearing footsteps by my window, and even a tap on the window. Sometimes I ignored them, and other times I look out to see who's there, but I never see anyone. Another night I'd been outside in my backyard again, after having a rough day. It was maybe 3 or so AM in the morning. I'm sitting outside on the trampoline relaxing. I suddenly notice it's quiet, like kind of an uneasy silence that feels like a vacuum. I get this feeling of dread like I'm being watched, and I snap my head to the left and catch a glimpse of a humanoid dark figure under the side of my fence immediately. I'm a little freaked out because I notice that this thing is pure black. The streetlight hits it, but didn't do anything at all. It almost looked cartoony, if that makes any sense, cause it's like the laws of physics don't apply to this thing. See, the reason I'm ranting about this is that I told both my friends my own story in psychology class at the same time. A lot of kids there live around my area, I mean like 5 to 15 max away, and they all start screaming, and the entire class went crazy when I finished because apparently they've all experienced the exact same thing as me. One girl told me about also hearing the tapping on her window at night. Another one told me about a really dark figure that seemed to follow her at night time, also screaming from the woods. Pretty much everyone's heard the screaming. It sounded the same, but that's the thing. In completely different time frames. That's the weird part because everyone's voice sounds different. So how could she describe the same thing I did? You know, like, if people were really killing each other out there, none of us thought it was an animal either. We all agreed from that point our town is pretty haunted, but I don't know. I mean, if there's any animal that sounded like that, I want to know, cause that didn't sound like anything I've ever heard before. I want to be enlightened, I want it to be something normal, but I just don't think it can be. The only person I heard of who's seen anything remotely specific is my friend's best friend from art school, who went on the bus, and apparently, like, it's really bad to talk about skinwalkers, and even worse, if you see them, it's like bad mojo. These things are said to be able to travel very quickly, so thinking about that made it seem like we experienced a skinwalker. Okay, so I had this saved in my notes for a while, but today I just asked my co-worker, who was also my friend in high school who lives nearby. He got all spooked and said that he's heard and seen the same things, but he's very spiritual and often has visions. He told me that he believes they're doing dark magic in the woods because of a dream he had about some hooded up group sacrificing a woman and a cat. Which is freaky because it also turns out that behind our local dog park, there's a patch of woods with dodgy stuff going down there. I was shown this by an acquaintance during my freshman year who lives a couple of streets away. Down the path in the woods, after some time of walking, there's this huge cross smack bang in the middle of nowhere. It's basically raw. Some crooked old nails struck together with a rope hanging from where you'd put your hands to be crucified. It's huge too, and whenever I decide to check it out, I have this horrible feeling like I don't want to be there or something bad's gonna happen. Anyway, he says I'm not the first person that he knows has told him about experiencing these things. He's also had his experience while there with humanoid figures. He says that he saw one turn around and look at him, directly in the eyes as though it was trying to intimidate him before vanishing. So we basically don't mess with anything in the woods near me. My father died about 5 years ago, unexpectedly from a heart attack. To say it was hard on my mother would be an understatement. Our old house in Knoxville just didn't feel the same anymore, and about a year later, my mum and I made plans to take ourselves and an elderly dog, Ace, to move further south to a small town situated about half an hour from Atlanta. Just a few days before we slated to move, I had one of the most vivid dreams I've ever come to experience. All that was within my dream was my bedroom, a picture-perfect recreation of the real thing. I sometimes wonder if it was a sleep paralysis. To further add to the dream's realism, in the middle of the night, the street lights come on across the street that illuminate my window, creating a reflection on the wall perpendicular. In my dream, as I lay there, staring at the exact reflection on the wall, I saw an orb of smoke fade in from the shadows. Goosebumps chill across my skin as I lay there panicked, afraid to move a muscle. Suddenly it stopped moving and steadily hung in the light's reflection as though staring at me. Without a warning, it spoke to me in my dad's voice. "I'm sending something to watch you." Despite hearing my father's voice from the orb, I'm terrified, and I don't know why. "What?" I whisper. The orb remains silent, leaving an eerily dead silence in the voice. "Damn, black." I woke up almost instantaneously. I'm gasping for breath now. The nightmare had chilled me to my core. I didn't know exactly what to make of it, especially the final words. I chalked it up to my dad wishing well on us maybe, but I couldn't shake the feeling. With the next couple of weeks, my mum and I moved out of Knoxville and headed down to South Georgia. She had managed to find a quaint little house for us. It had only 1 or 2 neighbours down there, and it's down the middle of a long gravel road in the middle of the woods. Nice for us. Probably the best reliever of all my stresses came with the move, however, was our neighbour's cat. She was a petite, older black cat that gravitated towards me almost instantly, and I treated her as though she's my own. I left out a can of food once or twice a week for her. Even if I didn't call out for her, when she saw me outside, she'd run up to me, helping ease my tensions. Less than a month into our new house, I suddenly awoke to a faint coughing that sounded like it was coming from downstairs. The important thing to know about our dog is that he has a collapsed trachea. He needs medicine to calm the condition down. So I'm used to walking up in the middle of the night to get his medicine. I proceed downstairs from my bedroom to give him his cough medicine, but I couldn't find him anywhere through the house. He wasn't in his bed sleeping, and he wasn't in the kitchen. I mean, literally nowhere to be found. I didn't check my mum's room, however, as I didn't want to wake her up. Besides, I wouldn't have heard the coughing if he had been in there anyway, so I just let it be. That's when I heard the coughing again, but it was coming from further away. It's outside now. I look over to the side door patio leading to the woodlands, and realised I'd forgotten to shut it. There it stood, slightly ajar. He got out. I immediately ran outside with a flashlight and started calling out for my dog. Ace! Ace! I shouted out into the neighbouring woods. I heard another cough and shined my light in its direction. That time, it had echoed from down the gravel road. I swear, a path had never looked so terrifyingly desolate before in my life. I stared down that long gravel road that led us to our new home, but in that moment, I thought my dog was lost, and chalk it up to the new house jitters. I go, Ace, come on, pressing on. But then I heard it, the cough I'd been following, almost right beside me. But this time, it didn't stay a dry cough like it had been before. Instead, it slowly descended into a low growl. I shined my light towards the sound. There stood a bright red fox in the middle of the path. For a moment, I figure it's the fox that I'd mistaken for my dog. The whole time, as I was processing what I was seeing, it stared directly at me, its eyes glowing. However, our stare was broke when it tilted its head to the right, looking down, and there was our neighbour's little black cat staring beside me. However, it had completely changed its persona, no longer happy, affectionate, not the cat I knew. Instead, it arched its back upright, every fibre of her hair standing uneasily, uttering the lowest growl I've ever heard from a feline. In that moment, I figured she's just scared of the fox, so I knelt down beside her in a bid to coax her away and avoid fox hunting her. But no matter how many times I tried to coax her out of fight mode, she wouldn't. That's when I looked towards the direction of the fox once more, but there wasn't a fox anymore. Instead, in the exact same spot of the gravel road, was a walking, rotten corpse of a coyote roadkill, slowly moving towards me. It took a step back. I'm absolutely mortified of what I'm seeing. Its jaws hanging loose, eyes are blood-stained, wobbling now. I rub my eyes in disbelief, hoping I'm imagining it. But it was there, and it was real. And despite what was in front of us, the black cat just kept on growling at me. Suddenly, it stopped, The creature had ceased its walk towards me. For a moment, it just stood there, glancing back and forth between myself and this little black cat that was trying to defend me. I now realise. That's when I mistakenly heard this beast mutter 2 words almost. Damn black. In a flash, the creature ran straight into the woods. I shined my flashlight in its direction, but it's completely vanished. Even the brush it came from looked untouched. That's when the cat standing behind me calmed herself down. Almost as though nothing happened, she rubbed herself against my leg, returning to normal, now in a very loving state and manner. Despite technically not being mine, I scoop her up and run back inside the house and upstairs with the little black cat snuggled up in my arms. I decide to poke my head into my mum's room. Lying on the floor, sound asleep, is Ace, who had been here the whole time. I quietly close her door before bolting upstairs, making sure the little cat slept with me that night. From the research I've done, I am almost certain that I was a victim of a skinwalker. Okay, I posted a skinwalker encounter yesterday. I found it helped me, getting it off my chest and out into the open. Now this story goes into some of the details about injuries. The details are not too bad in my opinion, but you've had your warning. Now for some background, I was 16, around 2016 when this happened. I live in Massachusetts, which is where this happened. The day starts normally. I went to school, had a test in vet tech, and I took the bus home. Both my parents were at work like normal, but after 3 hours when my mum should have been home, I got worried. Around 5 PM, I got a phone call from my dad who told me that my mum's in a car accident and they're both in the hospital and they're gonna be there for a while. It got very late, almost 10, and my parents weren't home, so I decided to put my younger brothers to bed. I stayed up waiting for my parents to get home. I spent my time reading and writing an essay for school until around 1 in the morning. I got a call from my dad who said that he wasn't coming home. He was staying in a motel that was closer to the hospital. I just got off the phone and finished that part of the essay that I was on. I gather my stuff and walk through the kitchen, heading towards the stairs that leads upstairs when a terrifying loud moaning screeches through my ears. The moaning came from outside. I mean, it's super loud, but would stop occasionally. Like whatever it was had a voice crack, almost sounding pained. I turn on the outside light to see an ugly sight. Sitting in the yard just feet from my house is a coyote, horribly injured. Its head's caved in, its paws bleeding. This was evident by the pool of blood. It appeared that it had a long, deep gash all down its back. I reach in my pocket going for my phone, only to realise I left it on the table I'd been working on. Oh God. I turn and rush back to the table. I was planning on calling a local vet clinic that I knew was open 24/7. When I reached the table, the moaning got much louder and more pained. Then it stopped. I grabbed my phone and ran back to the window. At first I was confused as hell. The coyote's gone, replaced by a common tabby cat. It was odd. The cat was sitting in exactly the same place that the coyote was sitting in. Weird. After the initial shock, I noticed that the tabby cat had the exact same injuries. Same part of the head caved in, same bleeding and gashes. Now I couldn't pinpoint the difference for a good few minutes, but then I realised that on the right shoulder blade it is exactly the same. I dropped my phone. As soon as my phone hit the floor, the cat starts meowing loudly. I'm now stuck here terrified as it meows at me. It's not even blinking. After a good 10 minutes, I slowly pick up my phone off the floor. I straighten back up and look out the window, and the cat's gone. It had only gone for a few seconds, and in that short time, it vanished. Some unknowing feeling come over me. I don't know what it was. Worry for the animal? Curiosity? Maybe. Hell, it might have been something that the animal made me feel. I have no clue. Now outside, I first walked to the blood puddle and looked for a trail of blood, and I found it. I started to follow the trail and found that it ended as soon as it got past the gates. To make sure that I just couldn't see it in the dark, I pulled out my phone and illuminated the ground. I looked for 5 minutes and don't find anything. Like the cat and trail had vanished. I called the veterinary clinic and they sent out a car. They look around for things, but they can't find anything. At the time I didn't think anything of this, but thereafter I realised there's no trail of blood leading to my house. I have no idea what this thing was. None of my searches have come up with anything. I'm honestly completely dumbfounded as to what this creature was. I only hope it wasn't a skinwalker attacking these. My wife and I were driving through the northern part of Arizona on Highway 89 between Flagstaff and Page. It's about 1 AM, as we're on the third shift at the time and often drove at night to avoid traffic. I saw a few set of eyes glowing in my headlights a little ways up the road, so I let off the gas, slowing down to avoid hitting an animal in the road. When we drove by, we see several dogs or coyotes on the side of the road, and I hit the gas and drove by. After we passed, my wife said, "One of them was running next to my car," and I looked over and saw it, probably 20 feet off the shoulder of the road. I floored it, and I see that it stood up on its own hind legs and kept pace with us for a couple of seconds before turning away from the road and disappearing. The whole event probably lasted no more than 15 seconds, but God, it is the most terrifying 15 seconds of my life. This was probably 20 years ago, and we still rarely talk about it. We live in a rural community on the Navajo reservation. My aunt and her 2 brothers were home alone while my grandparents had left for the evening to attend a chapter house meeting. They were in the house, and like many people from the reservation, they don't have electricity, and like many people there, they've been outside in the dark for about an hour, and my aunts and uncles are getting ready for bed. Outside, they hear noises, as though someone is moving things around them. My oldest uncle then went outside to see what's going on, and he saw a figure outside the truck. This was immensely out of the ordinary because the closest neighbour is miles away. Whatever it was opened the truck door and began to dig through personal items. My uncles and aunts were frightened by the sight and knew they must take action. They took out the rifle and steadied themselves to hold it up. They flung open the door, aiming the gun at the figure in the dark. They're shaken at this point. The figure then turned and starts towards them, totally unfazed by the weapon. My uncle pulled the trigger, but nothing happens. The figure drew closer and my aunt began to smell something like a rotten corpse. It's so strong she began to gag. My uncle continued to pull the trigger. No luck. The figure came closer and closer. But now, off in the distance, headlights are approaching. My grandparents are returning. The figure looks towards the lights and starts to move away and tucks itself behind a tree near the home. My oldest uncle ran towards a truck with the gun. My grandfather got out of the car and my uncle pointed to the tree. That thing was poking out its head to observe what they're doing. My grandfather ran into the house and over to the stove, grabbing a handful of ashes and rubbing it over the gun, and placed an ash-covered bullet to the chamber. He walked out onto the porch and fired towards a tree. Whatever that thing was did not expect the gun to go off. The gunshot echoed, and the figure began running. My grandpa chased my aunt inside and my uncles and grandfather went after it. There weren't many roads or paths, so as my grandfather and uncles chased after the figure, the truck was bouncing and the headlights were not fixed on one particular spot. My uncle swears that whenever the headlights would hit, the figure he saw a woman. Not only that, whatever it was running on its fours like a bear. My grandfather must stop now as they're nearing a ditch with a 30-feet drop. He got out and began to yell in Navajo. My uncle says that he was yelling about a local woman. He yelled that he wasn't scared and he knew it was her to leave the family alone. After a few days, there was the news that the woman that my grandfather was yelling about had passed. I've always been told that if you know who the skinwalker is, say their name and it will kill them. Out on the Navajo reservation, we don't have the city come and collect our trash, so we have to burn the trash out in these huge burning barrels. Not very eco-friendly, I know, but it's what we have to do. Now if you don't light the trash properly, the fire will go out and the trash will sit in the barrel. This is important because we are told to dispose of personal hygiene items. If you removed all your hair from your brush, make sure the trash burned. If it was that time, you had to make sure everything was burned. They tell us things because skinwalkers have been known to dig through trash in order to find out things they can use against us. They use the things that were briefly connected to bring misfortune onto others. Some of my family members take part in the sport of rodeo, so to practice, they have a dummy rope and throw it at things and try to bring them in. My two male cousins were enjoying themselves outside, taking turns swinging the rope at the fake calf. The elders are always adamant that we shouldn't stay up past sundown, where that it's pitch black for miles. But my cousins aren't superstitious and are under streetlight. My cousins are joking and laughing, having a great time. That changes when the oldest cousin looks over to a burn barrel. A dark figure is bent over, rummaging through the garbage that's failed to burn. My cousins devise a plan that they're gonna grab weapons and chase it. They move strategically so that they are able to flank the figure. They run full speed at it and begin yelling and swinging. My cousin states that they kept this up for the most part, until the figure ran under the streetlight. But that's when my cousins see that what they thought was actually a person is actually a goat. Why would they think it is a person? The goat was running on its hind legs. Fear runs through their bodies as the figure runs off into the darkness. Now feeling nervous, and not entirely accepting what they've just seen, They began roping the dummy again. There's an awkward silence amongst the boys who just saw something unnatural, but talking about it now would just make it seem real. The boys roped in silence until one of them looked over to a tree. There's a head peeking out at them. If they didn't pay attention to it, whatever it was would poke its head out from the tree to stare. When they would look in the direction of the tree, it would move quickly out of sight. This was the final straw. My cousins ran back into the house. They told their parents my uncle come out. It was still there, poking its head from behind a tree. My uncle loaded up his gun and starts walking towards the tree line. He aimed it and pulled the trigger. Gun jammed. Whatever it was began to run so fast it appeared to be a blur. When it left, my uncle came in and gave the boys a thorough lecture about staying out late. One of my cousins then told my uncle that whatever it was had been digging through the trash barrel. They went to investigate the creature that's hauled a lot of things out of the barrel, which was odd. There were tracks all around the area. They followed the tracks, but they suddenly vanish, dead in the middle of nowhere, with no possible way they could have went. The Navajo Reservation is the largest reservation in the United States. It goes into New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, and Arizona. This story takes place in the northeast region of Arizona, near Indian Wells. This was told by people from around that area. If you're heading west on State Highway 15, out towards Stilken, you come to a stretch of road that goes into a small valley. I remember going down this road in my youth. If you ever looked at the horizon, it would seem as if the road kept going. Then suddenly your car would be pulled down by gravity as though being followed by the road. It would always give me butterflies when we would get to the drop. When I heard about this story, it made my stomach feel different. A man was driving home one night and it's very late. It was a drive that he had done before, so he wasn't bothered by it. When you're driving on the reservation, sometimes there isn't any way to keep cattle from getting on the road. No fences means that you need to be extra aware. I always get told to look out for black horses. If you see a black horse, then you'll be able to see anything else that may wander into the path of your vehicle. So this man is driving home, not really paying much attention. He drives down the slope, but when he gets to the bottom of the valley, he sees it. He doesn't have time to react. Suddenly, a horse comes out of the darkness. He slams his brakes but can't stop. The impact is enough to deploy the airbags. The man is tossed around a bit. He turns on the emergency lights and gets out of the car to assess damage. The front of the car is crumpled and one of the headlights is destroyed. He cursed out loud. This was the worst place to have an accident. He didn't have signal for help. Then he thinks of the horse. This man went into his cab and got a small keychain flashlight. He starts shining around looking for the animal. He heard noises, but they don't sound like a horse. But he was absolutely positive that he hit a horse. As he approaches the sounds, he could see the animal's fur moving from its ragged breathing. As he got closer, he began to realize what it was. An elderly woman wrapped in a large spelt. She was moaning from pain. The man stopped dead in his tracks due to fear. He stumbled back to his truck. Although it suffered plenty of damage, he was able to drive off. Once he got signal again, he called the authorities. An ambulance drove out there and recovered her. She's then driven to the local care facility. Due to the fact that many of the healthcare staff were Navajo, no one wanted to touch the woman. The woman known in the community was thought to be bedridden. This was shocking because she was so far from home, and the state she was in was off-putting. She had on her attire when she arrived. The nurses called her family to come in. When she got there, they removed her jewelry. When her family got there, they were frightened. But there was some non-Navajo staff in there that provided care. She only had bumps and scrapes, which didn't make any sense at all. She's able to get up and walk around the same evening. She went home with her family that night, but apparently vanished after a few days. In Navajo culture, if you find out who a skinwalker is, you have the power to destroy them. After the community around India Wells found out, or more fittingly who she was, it was certain that her end come. I had pet rabbits as a kid. They lived outside in a cage, a really big cage inside like a bigger shed, so they had a pretty good life. But I went out with my older sister to feed them. At the time we were about 5 or 7. On the way out to the cage, we both saw what appeared to be a really tall man running inhumanly fast through our backyard. We live in what is basically a swamp, and had to have cleared this giant downed tree and run over mud and ferns. But regardless, he seems to be going through at least 20 miles per hour. We both dropped what we had and bolt inside. At the time our parents are able to convince us it's a deer. We wanted to believe them, but it just wasn't. I convinced myself for over a decade that that's what we saw. Fast forward to a few years ago, I was at a park near my house with my friend late at night. I pulled into the dirt road drive in my Outback and parked facing the old practice fence. Now we go to the field that was too foggy to see across, except for a split second. We can see what appeared to be a very tall man running across the field. We drove as fast as that Subaru could take us out that park. Now a couple of years ago, I was at the same park under similar circumstances. This time, it was clear but very windy. Now from across the field and into a field, we heard a crash and a scream. Not a crash then a scream, but simultaneous. It was the most shrill, terrifying, god-awful screech I've ever heard. More human than a fisher cat, but far louder and more sinister. Again, we noped it out of there as quick as possible. So for context, I live in southern Maryland on a large plot of land. We have 3 large farm dogs, 2 of whom are German Shepherds. They're very used to the various animals that pursue our property, and very rarely get spooked or upset. We also have lots of livestock, and it's uncommon for us to lose a random animal or find a pile of chicken feathers in the corner of our property. However, we've always been able to explain it or add extra protection for our flocks. Around 8 months ago, we started losing chickens at an alarming rate. They would disappear. Even our shepherds couldn't send them anywhere on the property. For a while, we figured it's just a barred owl or some other bird of prey. The main problem with that theory is that literally 10 would disappear at a time rather than the normal 1 or 2. We decided to put a trail cam up to watch our most eastern flock. Almost immediately, the problem stopped, so we took them down. But then it got stranger. I've always gotten sleep paralysis, and it's like to believe I'm pretty comfortable with my sleep paralysis demon. It's never really been something to concern me. However, around the same time as we started losing chickens, I would see something different in my sleep paralysis. Whereas my demon would chill in the corner and not move, this thing would hang around and move back and forth, almost like a sloth. It had long fingers and was really skinny, like, weirdly. It didn't appear human. I then noticed that it constantly stared at me, whatever part of the room I was in. At the time, I decided not to worry though, and figure it's just anxiety. Which brings us up to September 2018. One night at around 2, I woke up completely able to move my body. Everything seemed normal. No one else was sleeping in the house that night, but that's pretty standard around that time of year. I glanced up at my rafters and saw the long-fingered thing moving and looking at me. Immediately I turn on my bed lamp. It's gone, yet again. I talk it up to stress and decide to go downstairs to grab a cup of water. All of our dogs are happily asleep, and I went back to bed turning off the light. The second it was dark, I could see it again, without my eyes having to adjust. This freaked me out enough, but all of a sudden I heard a Rottweiler get up and start growling. He barks and growls. I call out, but he kept going. He got louder and louder until the other dogs joined in. Now, I turned the light back on, grabbing my hunting rifle. I went downstairs and took 2 of the dogs outside, and I swear to God, I've never heard a silent night like it. I moved my flashlight slowly around the perimeter looking for the shine of eyes, or anything. All of a sudden, the chickens are going haywire. Like so loud they distract the dogs, who sprinted out towards them. I followed them only to find no chickens, and our fence is torn down. There's no animals in the area that could even try to do that. So we quickly get inside and camped out for the evening. It was quiet after that, and when the morning came, the chickens are safely back home. I stupidly figured the problem solved and decided not to worry about it. The only thing was that I started seeing the long-fingered rafter thing every time I turned out the lights. Eventually I get so freaked out, I decide to call a shaman. She told us that we have a Wendigo problem, that she would come and sage the house. We opened every single window and door, letting her do her thing, but since then, we've had no problems. The issue now is that when we walk our dogs at night, or put the chickens inside, I swear someone's watching me. I've had a couple of other people bring up that they feel weird at night, and nobody goes outside alone anymore. Whenever we walk our dogs at night, they get so paranoid and don't want to move, especially not towards the forest. The creepiest part though is sometimes at night, we hear screaming. We assume it's often coyotes, but every once in a while, it's just off enough that we get scared. A couple of times it's been a lone shriek, which is very uncommon for foxes or coyotes, and a few nights ago, we were asleep in bed when we heard a scream from directly outside our window. My partner says that he's worried that someone was hurt, so he opened our window and yells, "Is anyone out there?" And we hear a lot of shuffling like somebody scrambling off. It sounded heavier than a bird of prey, but way lighter than a person. A dog started barking, and within a minute, we hear another scream a good mile away. First encounter was about 10 years ago. I had set up along a clearing and was a good 20 feet up in a tree. As dawn was approaching, I had a large 12-point buck slowly coming into the clearing about 400 yards off. I let it come closer and took aim and shot it in the kill zone through the heart with a 30.06 195 grain ballistic tripped round. After watching it fall through my scope, I slung my gun, getting ready to climb down. And then, I watched this deer get up, running back into the woods on two legs. I have no idea what happened, but had heard of skinwalkers in my youth from my grandmother, so I noped out of there immediately. A few years later, I was in the same hunting area. I had set up my stand and ladder the previous day, and around midnight hiked out to my stand so I could be ready for dawn. I got into my stand at around 2 AM and was waiting patiently. After a couple of hours, around 6 AM, 30 minutes till sunup, I heard something grab a hold of my ladder. Then it sounded like something was climbing my ladder. I pointed my rifle straight down and fired. I hit something on my first shot and heard a scream. So I naturally emptied the rifle, still pointing straight down the ladder. I didn't dare look down for fear of what I had heard in stories of locking eyes with these beasts. I pulled out my .357 mag revolver, proceeding to empty the cylinder towards the sound of movement again. Once that was spent, I reloaded it, continuing my barrage. There was still something out there and I could hear it. I had one bullet left. I pull out my 9mm that I kept with me. I fire a few rounds towards the noise. Then, I wait till the morning. A few rounds left in my 9mm, clutching it for dear life. When morning came, I look at my surroundings and climb out of my tree. Around my tree stand was a darkish blood, and it went off deeper into the woods. I hiked to the trail as fast as I can. When I got there, I saw someone else in the distance. He was going the same direction I was. He also looked scared. I reloaded everything while he was closing the distance. Once he got closer, I asked him if he's heading out too. He told me he heard a lot of gunshots and a scream. I asked him where the post was. He points in the direction where the blood trail goes. He said he heard something running by him after the gunshot stopped, and when dawn hit, saw something animist running around on two legs. I got his name. We'll call him Jim. And he told me that we should get out of the woods. He was a native to the area and half Cherokee, and told me if he saw what I saw, he would leave immediately. So we get out of the woods. Surprisingly, we both park in the same area and share a beer, and around noon, we summoned up the courage to go back for our things. After a slow hike, when we went to my stand first, my steel ladder that was secured by ratchet straps and bungees to the tree is literally ripped from the tree. It was bent and torn up. My tree stand is still in that tree to this day, I assume. He looked at the blood trail and went white. The tracks are a mix of human and canine. We made it to his tree stand after a bit. He was only 800 feet from where I was, amazingly. His gear, strewn across the forest floor like mine, a bent ladder, but unlike my tree stand, His had been ripped from the tree. We both left the area and went back to our vehicles. So after that encounter, Jim and me traded phone numbers and hung out. Whenever I went to hunt, we'd do this. But it kind of become a thing to go hunting together now. He knew the woods better than I did. He was good company. And about 2 years after the incident that caused us to meet, we posted up in a blind cage in a clearing. We generally put our stands close, or hunted back to back in a blind over the 2 years we hunted together. If one of us had a shot when we're in a blind, we would signal to the other with a tap from our elbows. That morning, we both had a shot. We both fired. I hit a doe. I was aiming square in the chest. As it went down, it turns and runs on its back legs, dead sprinting into the woods. Jim's quarry did the same thing after he hit it. We went to investigate, and once the animals turned, the hoof sprinters got larger, and then changed to human tracks. Jim said we have to leave, and I'm not going to disagree with him. We both stopped hunting in the woods after that encounter. I have no clue to this day what happened in those woods. I've heard of skinwalkers before, but from what I can tell, they're far more durable. I mean, I used a 30.06 with 195 grain ballistic tip rounds every time I go hunting. Nothing should be able to survive that, especially where I hit them. But those are my stories. I hope to God I don't get any more. The area that we lived in initially was a slightly out of town neighbourhood near a park that was a sacred site to the tribe of the Anzi before them. Because of its location, it was a bit isolated and the homes were all company owned. I mean, most of them had stood empty for quite a while, to be honest. But the company that my SO worked for at the time had just started opening them up for their employees. There were maybe 15 homes in this little pocket neighbourhood with lots of space between them, and only 3 of them had anybody actually living in them, including ours. On our street, there was a single empty house across the street, some basketball courts next door, an empty house next door to that, and an occupied home at the very top of the road with its back to the park. Now the streets out on the Navajo Res are pretty dark, even in neighbourhoods. For this long road, there were just 2 street lights, one at the bottom and one at the top. So being in the middle is quite dark and pretty awesome to stargazing at the same time. Our house is nestled at the bottom at the steep slope, so the road in front of us is up a 6-foot ridge. I'd been out there for less than a year when it all started. I was a smoker, so I'd go out in the evenings to smoke, and I'd sit outside on my bench, smoke a cigarette and bounce between them, looking at the stars, checking around my feet for scorpions. Bloody hell. The first thing I ever noticed was hearing a kind of mad and chaotic flute sound. It sounded like somebody had a recorder and told a toddler, "Play it now." Some poor parents in this practically empty neighbourhood had given their kid a recorder and were being tortured with it. God damn. I kind of laughed at their imagined misery and didn't think much of it. The next night, at around 9:30 again, I heard the same flute sound, laughing at the poor parents. I don't think much of it, but it's the same after that. On the 4th night, however, I was up later than usual and went outside to smoke a cigarette. I heard a whoop sound coming from the basketball court, where the next door neighbours are, but I can't figure out where the sound's coming from. It appears to be a small pocket of trees, but I'm not certain. It sounded distinctly human, so I decided to call it a night and go to bed. The following night, I went outside for a cigarette and was sitting there when I saw something small and distinct moving through the trees, but on the road. I sat there smoking, watching it, trying to figure out what this thing was. I wasn't too worried because my SO was awake in the front room with the front door open, and if anything was going to whoop me at the time, he would be there in a second. Whatever it was though, it doesn't look human. It was far too small and low to the ground, so I just watched it, curious to see what it was. Now its fur is very light coloured. When it cleared the trees, it actually started to casually continue up the road in front of my house. I figured that, yeah, it's a cat because of the size and colour. Now I think to myself, there's no way it can be anything else. I mean, it has to be a cat. To me, it looked like somebody's cat's gotten out of their home and just got lost or something. I start to get worried about it though, because the house at the top of the road has some big dogs living there, so I put my cigarette out and decided that an investigation's in order. I made my way up my driveway and slowly tried to catch up with the cat because I don't want to scare it and send it running straight into the dogs where it'll meet its fate. There didn't seem to be much of a rush though, as the cat had taken a meandering on the road ahead of me, so I start calling it softly, trying to coax it over to me so I can rescue the poor thing. When I get within 10 feet of it, however, I realise that there's something seriously wrong with it. It had no tail, its body is lumpy and odd. It looked as though it's floating above the ground instead of walking on it, and its legs swung back and forth rhythmically instead of stepping. The head didn't even appear to have ears. I feel absolute terror. I have no idea what I'm looking at, because this is not right. Something about the whole situation is just off. I've run down the driveway, having my hand on the screen door to go inside when I stop myself and turn to look at it one more time. The not cat had stopped where I'd been sitting, with the ridge and a chain link fence between us now. I then run inside. I figured it was safe to keep watching it because I must figure out what it is at least, surely. I let the screen door go and turn to watch. After a few seconds, the not cat started working its way up the road again towards the house at the top. Just before it got to where the lights from the streetlight shone down though, it stopped in the dim light and started to roll around furiously in the clay. All I could see was fur and dust, but then it stopped and rose up, this time appearing much larger than the cat before. It moved into the light, and that's when I saw what appeared to be an elderly woman. She slowly walked on all fours and quickly positioned herself directly under the streetlight, then crouching down to stare at me. I don't know how long we stared at each other for, but at that point, my SO spotted me outside the door, totally frozen, coming out to investigate. I don't say a word, and he looked over at where I was staring. I'm now uttering some weird, scared obscenities. He grabbed me and dragged me into the house, closing the door behind me. He was Navajo, so was pretty upset that I was gawking at a skinwalker instead of running inside and locking the door behind me like a sensible person. He was even more livid when he found out that I had actually thought it was a cat trying to capture it. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and had to deal with my gaming friends and even my mother, who knew I never done drugs or drank before, implying that I was somehow either drunk or high from this experience. Thanks, Mum. The rules totally changed after that night. I wasn't allowed to go outside anymore without my SO, and never after he went to bed. On our next visit shortly after this, we were eating dinner in the kitchen when my cat very uncharacteristically jumps on me. He's never done this before. He climbs on my shoulder and starts hissing and growling at something behind me. The only thing behind me was the laundry room with a small little window, and my SO and eldest saw the past gloopy white face of a skinwalker peering through it, watching us eat dinner. This can't be real. All we could really do was shut the door to the laundry room and not go outside. Out on the res where we were at, the garbage cans were kept in these elevated cages to keep animals, especially wild dogs, from knocking them over. The next morning, we came out to find our garbage cans are completely rifted through. When we put them back, we spotted dusty mountain lion tracks on top of one of the lids. To me, this is really interesting because it wasn't a random collection of paws like you'd imagine from an animal working up there knocking it over. No, they were neatly lined up like the mountain lion was a bunny scrolling across the top of it. They were definitely not legitimate animal tracks, but more like somebody stamped to the top with a mountain lion paw. It was at this point that my SO decided that we need to contact a medicine man. What we didn't know at the time was that during all of this, my eldest had woken up in the middle of the night and thought he heard me, so turned on his light to come and see me. It took him at least 15 years to tell me about this, but apparently, when he come out of his room, he realised our door was shut and the lights were all off in the house. He looked down the hall and saw two dimly glowing red eyes. He did what any 6-year-old does and closed the door and hid. Anyway, my SO called his uncle, whose father was a medicine man, and told him what we were seeing. Our medicine man was a crystal gazer and singer and was really interesting. We didn't tell him anything about what we had seen at all, but somehow he knew everything. He knew that I had seen this very unusual coloured fur and told us that the skinwalker that I had seen was actually the head of the locals. She's very old and the one to wear the fur. Her purpose out there that night was to teach the youngers how to be better predators. Unfortunately for us, because I reacted the way I did, the elderly skinwalker decided that I must have power that she's not seen before, so there was nothing we could do. She's now interested. She wanted to find out what my power was, and if I posed any threat to her. If I don't, then she's gonna try and kill me and take my power. Luckily for me, I didn't have a power other than an equal measure of abject stupidity and curiosity. Unlucky for us, because of this, she never figured out what my power was, and she's maybe resentful for the fact that I got completely duped and rushed inside thereafter. It didn't matter what the house we lived in from that moment on. The flute started up at night, and thereafter, skinwalkers would appear. My father owns a small delivery service that operates out of Farmington, NM. We mostly deliver small packages out to the middle of nowhere that are too much of a hassle for large delivery companies to bother with. My dad is the only employee, and we have a few pickup trucks and a trailer. One day, we get a delivery out to Window Rock, Arizona, on the Navajo reservation, about 2 hours from Farmington. My dad gets a call for the job while he's chilling with his Navajo friend, so he's there with Travis and his girlfriend. Travis mentions how he's got family in Window Rock, and he hasn't seen them in ages and suggests to go with him. It was about 6 or 7 at the time, and it was in the summertime, so my dad decides that we'll go down together. He can do his delivery really quick, then while Travis sees his family, we can go check out the window rock, which is a big rock with a large hole in it. It's pretty cool. Now we had to go in separate trucks, because my dad's is weighed down with freight. We decided to bring along some walkie-talkies so we can communicate with one another. We spend our time in Window Rock and everything is generally uneventful, and we start heading home along the old highway with my dad and I in front, and Travis and his girlfriend in the truck behind us. Now I honestly don't remember most of the Window Rock trip, but this next part I can never forget. Now we're somewhere along the highway between Window Rock and Gallup NM. It had just rained earlier in the day, and the rock was kind of slick, so we're taking it slow. On the left of the highway there's nothing but sandstone cliffs, and on the right there's a huge field, separated from the road by a small fence. We crest the top of the hill, and go towards the bottom, and see what appears to be a really large dog, sitting back on its own in the middle of the road facing the cliffs. My dad calls over the radio and says, "Hey Trav, did you see that big dog?" Travis starts yelling up and says, "That's not a dog. Speed up now and hit it," almost sounding hysterical. He just keeps screaming, "Hit it, please hit it now." So my dad starts speeding up, and as we get a bit closer, I can begin to see it a bit more clearly. It's covered in this brown wiry matted hair that appears to have blood dried over it. It is still facing the cliffs, but the moment our headlights hit it, it turns and sees us. And it has a face. I don't know how else to describe it other than it's a mix between a bear and a human's face. It looks twisted and distorted, almost in pain. As we get closer to the thing, we start to realise it's actually huge. Though it was sitting on its back legs, it's still massive. We literally get inches from hitting it when it lets out this scream that sounds like somebody's filling up their lungs with water trying desperately to get sounds out. It then leaps towards the field, landing just on our side of the barbed wire fence, then leapt over another, and it's gone. Travis comes on over the radio again saying, "Please keep driving, we have to get out of here, go faster." He kept repeating the last part, "We have to get out of there and go quick." Pretty soon we're speeding like crazy, and just as we start to get near somewhere, we get pulled over. Travis pulls his truck over with us, and naturally this makes the cop, a Navajo man himself, very on edge, and he immediately asks why Travis felt the need to pull us over as well. Travis says, "Dude, we just saw a skinwalker a few miles back and it's been following us." The officer turns white and says he's got no problems with us, and just says make sure we keep going. We didn't see anything else that night, but when we got home, Travis refused to let us go without taking home some kind of Navajo totem thing that's supposed to keep it away. So I live in a weird neighbourhood, in the oldest house there. A rich guy built this house here as a hunting lodge in the 1800s. Now before it become a little tucked away shrub within the house in bloom post World War II. Maybe it's worth mentioning that my parents brought the home from the last two remaining descendants of aforementioned rich guy, who both promptly died after the sale. Now this neighbourhood is known for having weird things happen here, even in the town. I mean strange lights, ghosts, even cryptic creatures. A lot of occultists exist in the area too. Now, here's what's weird about the neighbourhood. The coyotes. There's a giant pack of coyotes in the area. Normally in a wooded area, that's fine, because the coyotes are on steroids, huge muscular things, and they look mangy. They've been known to track and follow hikers, and often people's pets and livestock get mauled or killed by them at night. They're just huge. To someone who isn't local, they think they're wolves. At night, they howl, bark, scream and yelp, starting almost like clockwork at 12. There's rumours that they aren't exactly coyotes, just because of how strange they look and behave. Now, I actually spoke to a native friend of mine who said they sound an awful lot like his childhood stories of skinwalkers or wendigos. I did some research, but I didn't know if it could be related, really. He told me to remain inside at night and don't investigate sounds. Normally, I've avoided the pack's troublemaking. I have no animals that go outside, as my 4 indoor cats always stay in. The main hangout seems to be the farm or ranch up the street. However, until the other night, now full disclosure, I've been smoking, but not really enough to trip this, but regardless, there was a single coyote in the neighbour's yard across the street. It was barking, howling and yelping at the coyotes, like they do every night, but again, completely alone. It didn't sound right. It sounded like a very good coyote impression, but not good enough to be believed 100%. I suddenly remembered what my native friend had warned me of, and slowly closed and locked my window, shut my blinds and hid underneath my comforter. The howling and yelping abruptly stopped. Now there's some really tense silence for minutes. Then it starts whistling. It was some piss poor attempt at calling a bird. At that point, I knew it was exactly what I'd been warned of, but what can I do? Get up and run? Risk making more noise? I'm frozen. Then I heard scuffling across the roof, near my bedroom window, which is right above my head. There was some ragged breathing. Yes, quiet, but it sounds like the wind. Then my ears start to ring, unbearably loudly, enough that it hurt. It became louder, like something's coming closer to me. As the sounds get louder, I become more terrified now. I started to hear scraping against the glass on my window, like somebody with long fingernails is placing their hands on the glass, dragging them across it. All the while, I was still under my blanket holding my breath, trying my damn best to convince myself to stay still. Whatever was out there, please leave me alone. Like my prayers are being answered, suddenly it stopped, and the howling and barking resumed though. As usual, spot near the ranch down the street. God, at dusk the next day, I wafted a lit sage bundle indoors and out, and sprinkled salt at every entry point. Nothing's happened yet, but I'm not safe. I never saw that thing outside the window again, but I'm so scared it's gonna come back. I'm sure it's stalking me now. I just pray it stops. I was driving home from work. I work nights on an Air Force base and stopped by McDonald's to treat myself after my PT test. I had to drive extremely far from my home to find an open McDonald's at 2:15 in the morning. When I finally found one, about 30 minutes from home. After getting my food, I start driving home. The entire way home, I felt an extremely existential dread, like something was off, but about the road I was on. And I felt like I was alone and would never see my wife again. I was on a stretch of highway with trees on both sides and 0 cars passing. After about 10 minutes of driving with no other cars, I saw a spotlight. The light was green, but there was a deer standing under the light. Now it had been raining a hell of a lot, and there's a puddle under the deer, making it appear as though its legs are conjoined in a weird way, and that it's around a foot taller than it should have been. When I drove up to it, I realised it wasn't a reflection, and that's just how it was. I went to drive around it, and as soon as my front bumper got past the deer, my radio suddenly blasted static. I turned the radio off and floored it. When I was around the deer, the radio come on again. Now things get worse. The deer seems to be running right alongside me at stupid speeds. I went 20 over the speed limit on my way home because I had to. Cut through private housing, over speed bumps and whatnot. I had to lose this thing. I got to my driveway, sprinted inside, shut all the curtains and locked the doors. And since then, I've been too scared to even drive at night again, let alone go out on my own. I was 17 at the time. I just got on my first job. I lived in Western Virginia, in a small mountain community. My mum's best friend owned a camping resort not far from my house that had a general store. She said she'd pay me to help out in the store during the busy months in the summer. It was a pretty easy job, and I met a lot of out-of-towners, which was nice because our community gets so isolated. Most of us live really far from each other. Now one day, a big burly mountain man come into the store. He's in his early 50s and probably 6'5" and about 280 pounds. He looked dirty, like he worked outside a lot. His clothes are tattered and he wears a long beard. He looked like a woodsy hermit person. He brought some basic items, one of which was a homemade soap bar, when he came to the register. Now he looks at me carefully and says, "Did you make this soap?" "Possibly. Yeah, I do sometimes." "You make a lot of your own stuff?" "Yeah, kinda." "I like that a lot," he said, nodding to himself. I honestly didn't know how to reply. I quickly rung up his items and paid with the crumply money that he had. Right before he left, he said, "You cook too?" "Sometimes." "Bet the boys round here are itching to marry you," he said as he smiled to himself. I was puzzled as to what I said that stood out as wife material. I told my friend's boss about the bizarre encounter and she laughed at it. But then, the mountain man started turning up more often than not. We chatted a little here and there, and as I found out, he had a cabin in the woods. He claimed he built it with his bare hands. He said he hunted and lived off the land, other than the things he brought to the store. Over time our chatter escalated, with him making comments about how nice it would be to have a woman like me up there making things for him. One time he even said, "birthing hips that men lust after." God, so creepy. He even started inviting me to fish with him, hunt, etc. I politely declined, but he got more and more insistent, and I told my boss how weird I felt. The intensity with which he said things really started to scare me. She actually said to me that when he came in, go get her and she would ring things up. "Ah, thanks," I said. I started speaking to him less, and I thought that I wouldn't have to deal with him anymore. But one night, I was closing up, and it's late. Around 10 at night. The other worker left before. I was by myself. The only two cars in the front of the store were an old blue pickup and mine. I was immediately alarmed because I knew the mountain man drove one, but I didn't see him in the parking lot, just his car, so maybe, just maybe it's okay. So I quickly walk up to my car and check the back seat before I start her up. But that very moment I turn the ignition, I got nothing but shudders. And my car won't start. It's weird that I had a weird feeling as I was doing so and the car didn't start. Of all nights, why is this happening now? I remembered asking myself angrily, just as I was reaching for my phone to call for help. There's a loud pounding on the driver's side window. I'm shocked that I don't wet myself. I don't even want to look, as I know it's him, but I did. And my suspicions are confirmed. He has a huge grin on his face, showing me his teeth which are missing. I need some help, he said loudly through the window. I shook my head furiously. My dad's on the way, I said, hoping to scare him off. I hadn't spoken to my dad in years. A smile comes across his face. No he's not. Open the door. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up straight. Did he know I was bluffing? No, I said firmly, leave me alone. Suddenly he's angry. He pulled the handle hard, but I locked the door first. He kept furiously pulling the handle and started pounding on the window. Leave now or I'm calling the cops, I screamed. He doesn't get the message, so I pulled out my phone and called 911. I must have sounded hysterical to the dispatcher. I knew she could hear him pounding. She said that they would have an officer out there ASAP, but that could be a while out here. The cops are here, leave now, I screamed at Mountain Man, who didn't seem to let anything deter him. But after a moment or few, he stopped. He suddenly walks back to his truck and I watched him go. Hopefully he leaves me. But then, he started walking back towards me with a crowbar in his hand. No! Get away from me! I screamed. He started swinging at the driver's side window with the crowbar. I ducked down into the passenger seat of the floor and covered my head for dear life. I hear the sickening crack of the window. I know I'm seconds away from death now, but not for long. I heard a male voice shouting, telling him to get away from the car. I see two men approaching, one with a shotgun. I instantly recognize them as people camping nearby. I breathe a sigh of relief and get out of the car, telling them the police are coming. I thank them profusely and wait for the police. Surprisingly, Mountain Man didn't make a move. The cops appeared quickly after, so he didn't have much of a chance. They took him away and I gave my statement. I was pretty shaken up thereafter. After a few weeks, I finally got the scoop on the man. Apparently he had a history of mental illness and had been in and out of institutions. He had really been living in an old cabin in the woods where he didn't take meds. My cousin Luke is a cop and later told me more about the case. The police did a search of the cabin to see if there's anything interesting. Apparently, he kept a journal on me, how he wanted me to be his wife. He mentioned my name a lot, and Luke said there's lots of weird things he didn't want to share with me about what he saw, but tried putting them simply by saying that he had a detailed plan of how to abduct me, starting with sabotaging my car engine to get me into a vulnerable position. When Luke told me that, I burst into tears, thinking just how horribly things could have went that night. Thankfully, he's been put back into a state institution. With any luck, he'll get the help he needs.